What is the strangest snake on Earth? Snakes are weird animals. They don't have legs, many of them are highly venomous, and some of them are rarely seen. So today, we're taking a full-on deep dive into the world's strangest snakes. Now, if you don't know what an iceberg is, basically this video we're going to be going down to the depths, to the deepest details of strange snakes, both their ecology, their distinct features, and all the things you've probably never learned about them before, starting off with the most common knowledge, all the way down to the most obscure. Starting off in the US, we have the Hognose snakes. These stout little snakes are famous for their awesome defensive displays. When cornered or confronted, Hognose snakes will actually hood up like a cobra, and some of them will hiss really loud. These snakes are pretty dramatic, and sometimes they'll roll onto their back, hang their tongue out, and wriggle around to act like they're dead or dying. They're usually really easy to identify since they got that little upturned snout, hence the name hognose snake, which they use as a shovel to burrow through loose and sandy soils. They're also a rear-fanged, mildly venomous species. Not particularly dangerous to people, but if you're a small amphibian, you certainly have to watch out for hognose snakes. Among the American hognose snakes, my favorite is of course the eastern hognose. Usually about 2 to 3 feet in length when grown, they come in a variety of patterns and colorations, my favorite of which are the oranges and the reds. In fact, I used to nickname the red hognose snakes scarlet hognoses. My locality of hognose snake here in South Louisiana has almost been entirely extirpated, and it's certainly one of the snakes that I don't get to see regionally, but throughout other states they can be fairly common. Hognose snakes across their range are environmentally sensitive. In fact, the southern hognose snake, found throughout many parts of Florida and Georgia, are considered a threatened species. In fact, they used to range into many other states. We believe this is mostly due to their diet, which is primarily toads, and if you live in the southeast, you've probably noticed we just don't have as many toads as we used to. We also have the Mexican and western hognose snakes in the more arid parts of the country, and many of you have likely seen western hognose snakes at some point in your life, either in videos or in the pet trade, since they are a pretty common pet snake. Hognose snakes are cool, but compared to some of the snakes that we're going to cover today, these guys aren't the strangest. And another strange snake that we have here in the US is the rubber boa. If you're somebody that doesn't like snakes, you've at least got to give the rubber boa a chance. Found throughout much of the western US into southern Canada, these snakes inhabit a wide range of environments, from coastal forests and mountain meadows to sagebrush flats and even deserts. They are incredibly adaptable. They spend a lot of their time in underground burrows, sometimes emerging at night to hunt for small mammals, particularly nesting rodents. Their tail is this kind of dumpy shape, and it's actually meant to mimic their head. So small shrews or deer mice, other prey items, will often mistake its tail for its head and attack that. Rubber boas have these really weird scales and a lot of loose skin, giving it that rubbery texture, hence the name rubber boa. There are currently 2 species of rubber boa, the northern and the southern, and of the 2, the northern is much more common. They never bite when handled, they're super soft, and they are certainly one of the friendliest snakes in the US that you can encounter. Between the hognose and the rubber boa, you'll notice that most of the strange things about them come from the way that they defend themselves. Hognose snakes will hood up and play dead. Rubber boas have a tail shaped like their head to distract predators. But what if I told you that perhaps the most disrespectful way to both distract and escape a predator in the snake world is to crop dust them? You see, there are some snakes in the southwest deserts that will actually fart to distract potential predators. Now in the snake world, it's actually called cloacal popping, but that's pretty much what it is. There are 2 snakes that tend to do this, and the first is the Chihuahuan hooknose snake. They sort of look like a hognose snake. As you can see, they have that strange pointed snout, but they tend to be a lot smaller, usually a lot less stocky, and unlike hognose snakes, these guys mostly eat small invertebrates, although they will go for an odd lizard and occasionally even a smaller snake. Not a lot is known about these guys because they're very fossorial, and not a lot of people tend to live where they do. There's also another species here in the US called the thorn scrub hooknose snake, and the reason I'd rather talk about the Chihuahuan hooknose is because I have still not found a thorn scrub hooknose. These things are really tough to find. And our other weird crop dusting snake is the Sonoran coral snake. These highly venomous little elapids are pretty secretive, usually coming out during the rainy seasons to hunt for other small fossorial snakes. I find it interesting that a highly venomous snake like the Sonoran coral would need another means of deterring would-be predators. But when you look at the nature of the Sonoran coral, you'll find that these snakes almost never want to bite, even in self-defense. Their neurotoxins are designed specifically for their prey. And not only do they not want to waste their venom, these snakes just simply aren't aggressive. So yeah, that's a pretty weird way for these snakes to defend themselves. But these snakes' behavior isn't just limited to how they avoid becoming prey, but also what they're preying on. When you think about what a snake eats, you probably probably think of rodents, lizards, frogs, maybe sometimes fish or eggs, but the truth is, snakes can eat some pretty bizarre stuff. In fact, many snakes are specifically built to just hunt one or a few prey items. The centipede snakes are small snakes that you might have also heard called crowned or black-headed snakes. These guys are typically only a few inches long, and they can be found throughout the Americas. Currently, there are about 50 well-recorded centipede snake species, but the strangest one is the cucalata, otherwise known as the Big Bend blackhead snake. These guys primarily feed on giant desert centipedes. You know, the ones that are like 8 inches long, giant fangs, the ones that sometimes eat small mammals. Those ones. Yeah, cucalata eat those guys. I can only imagine what possesses a snake to wake up and go, all right, time to go fight a giant centipede about my size. But it is what they are built to do. As their name suggests, they live in the Big Bend region of the Trans-Pecos Desert in West Texas and northern Mexico. These are actually my favorite Texas snake, and in my opinion, the coolest of the centipede snakes. While these certainly aren't the only snakes globally that primarily eat centipedes, they are a good example of how snakes will eat weird things, and cucalatas are the most extreme version of this. Now, it kind of makes sense that snakes would eat weird things in the desert. After all, it is pretty sparse, and you've got to take what you can get. But aquatic snakes can also have some really bizarre diets. If you haven't already, meet the mud snake.
What? Whoa! Oh, yes!
These bizarre aquatic snakes can be found throughout the southeast US in a variety of wetland environments, where their primary food source is a giant salamander species called the Amphiuma. If you live in this region, you might have also heard the Amphiumas called Congo eels. Mud snakes are typically a very elusive species, spending a lot of time inside crawfish burrows and mud tunnels hunting for their prey. Since Amphiumas are incredibly slippery, they also have a small spine on the end of their tail to help stab and grasp Amphiumas with. And I'd have to imagine that sometimes the mud snake does not win. A large Amphiuma could absolutely eat a smaller mud snake. There are 2 species of mud snake here in the US, the eastern and the western, and of the 2, I think the westerns look the nicest, especially here in my home state of Louisiana. In the same group, we have what is arguably the most beautiful snake in North America. And in some regions, it's one of the rarest. The rainbow snake. Sometimes nicknamed the eel moccasin, rainbow snakes primarily eat American eels. And as you can imagine, this isn't something that we see too often. Both the rainbow snake and the American eel are incredibly difficult to study, and the fact that they both seem to be disappearing from regions across the Gulf Coast makes it even more difficult. Their bright yellow pattern and red striping makes them an easily recognizable snake, enough that when people who don't know much about snakes see one, they tend to think it's either an escaped pet or something really special. And it certainly is something special. I've been lucky enough to encounter and even work with rainbow snakes over the years. And I've even helped expand our current knowledge on the species. And my honest opinion is that these snakes are in a whole stack of trouble due to habitat alterations and less American eels in their waterways. We can certainly see this in some areas, as the Florida rainbow snake has almost entirely vanished and is considered extinct. In my opinion, these are some of my favorite, most beautiful creatures in the world. Second only to my beautiful, soon-to-be wife, Emily, who actually did the amazing artwork you see behind me. Both Ferencia snakes, the mud snake and the rainbow snake, are some of, and many other people's, personal favorites here in the US. They're gorgeous, they have weird ecology, and they're rare. And overall, they just don't look like your average snakes. And it's a great example. Some very specialized species will niche themselves down and survive by only eating things that other snakes would really struggle with. And few snakes take that as serious as the snail eaters, particularly the cloudy snail-eating snake, which is probably the most successful snail eater in the world. These small nocturnal snakes can be found all the way from central South Mexico, all through Central America, and into parts of South America. They tend to live in a variety of different tropical environments, where snails and slugs are more plentiful. They have a really slender body and these big bulky heads, with these really buggy eyes, mostly for helping them hunt at night. And when they actually find a snail, they pull them out of the shell. For years, I actually thought they just ate the whole snail, kind of like how some snakes will eat eggs. And maybe sometimes they do with smaller ones, but for the most part, they actually prefer to just eat the soft soft body. There are currently 22 known species of New World snail eaters, but some of them are so rare that we don't know anything about them. And it wouldn't surprise me if there's a few new species waiting to be discovered. I actually really like the cloudy snail eaters. I know that there are more common species of snail eater, but they're so widespread, they're so successful, and they are certainly a strange looking snake. They're highly specialized, and while a lot of snakes do have this thin, buggy-eyed build, these ones are some of my favorite. And speaking of weird, stringy looking snakes, we have the vine snakes. As their name suggests, they look just like a vine. And you might be thinking, wow, that's a really cool, tropical, jungle-looking snake. And most of the time, you'd be correct, except for the one exception that comes into the US, the thorn scrub vine snake. While they're actually quite common in Mexico, in Arizona, this is one of the most unique snakes that you can encounter. Found mostly in canyons and thorn scrub habitats, right along species that just barely range into the state. Like the aforementioned thorn scrub hooknose, this snake is one that many people will never get to see. Despite that bizarre appearance that doesn't look like it belongs in the desert Southwest, these snakes are incredibly hard to spot. They're also a rear-fanged and mildly venomous species. Certainly not something to be concerned about getting bit by though, especially because you'll probably never see one. But it is something that helps them subdue their prey like small lizards. The thorn scrub vine snakes have certainly given me a run for my money because I have also never found one. But hey, it's coming. These guys live in some awesome habitat and I'm looking forward to getting back out into their range. And that seems to be the theme of the strange snakes. Whether it's bizarre diets or odd bodies, habitat is usually the driving factor. And nowhere is that more obvious than our next batch of snakes. Now we're getting into the snakes with some really weird tails, the clone snakes, and some of the weirdest venomous snakes. Snakes can have weird tails. Usually a snake's tail looks like the rest of its body, just a slow taper, and it oftentimes makes up a very small portion of its body. Some will use it for climbing, others will use it as a caudal lure to attract potential prey, but most snakes will actually rattle their tail when disturbed. But there's one group of snakes that we all know does this better than any other, and that's the rattlesnakes. Now, you might not think that rattlesnakes are all that strange. After all, we have covered every single rattlesnake species on Earth at some point on this channel. But they're America's most iconic snakes for a good reason. Rattlesnakes only live on the New World continents, that being North and South America. And as we know, they're defined by that rattle on the end of their tail, a stack of interlocking hollow beads that make a really loud trilling sound. A lot of people don't know this, but I actually have to turn down the rattlesnake noise in videos so that y'all can hear me. There's a lot of weird rattlesnakes that we could talk about, like the long-taileds in Mexico or the Massasauga, but the strangest and most unique rattlesnake is the sidewinder. Sidewinders are a really small species of rattlesnake found throughout the deserts of the American Southwest and into northern Mexico, where it specializes in surviving some of the harshest desert environments that we have. Through that bizarre form of locomotion called sidewinding, the snake throws its body loop sideways across the sand, usually only keeping 2 points of contact with the ground, hence the name sidewinder. This minimizes the contact with a scorching hot surface, and it helps prevent the ground from giving way under them. This helps them move pretty quickly, and it also keeps contact minimal with hot surfaces. They're ambush predators, usually waiting for small lizards or rodents. I still remember seeing my first sidewinders back in 2019, and it's really cool how distinct their tracks are compared to other snakes. Undeniably, sidewinders are one of the most unique rattlesnake species, but when it comes to bizarre desert snakes with a weird tail, I'm afraid these snakes have some crazy competition, because halfway across the world, we might have one of the most bizarre snakes on our list. You've probably seen pictures of this snake before. Some of you certainly know what it is, and others oftentimes wonder if it's fake, and I'm here to tell you that the spider-tailed horned viper is very real. The first thing you notice about this snake is its tail. This tail looks weird. It almost looks damaged at first. And that's exactly what the first biologists thought when they discovered this snake in the 1960s. In fact, they thought its tail was the byproduct of some kind of predation event or even cancer. But we soon learned that this snake uses its tail to hunt for birds. Its tail mimics a spider, hence the name spider-tailed. There's an incredible documentary segment from a few years back that was actually voiced by David Attenborough, and I highly recommend checking it out. It is some of the most incredible footage that we have of spider-tailed horned vipers. Endemic to the western portions of Iran and eastern Iraq, these snakes live in high elevation gypsum habitat, with lots of gypsum rock crevices, which are better at staying cool in an otherwise hot environment. Its closest relative, the Persian horned viper, actually has a very typical looking tail, and to my knowledge, this is the only snake on Earth that has a tail like this and employs this specific strategy. But it's believed that these snakes actually will change their diet as they get older, similar to a rattlesnake. So for instance, while they're smaller, they might use that tail to attract lizards, and then slowly as they get larger, they switch to birds. But hey, that's just a theory. Bizarre tails are just one of the ways that snakes can be extraordinary or gain an advantage. For rattlesnakes, this helps them ward off predators, and for spider tails, it helps them catch their prey. But what if, instead of increasing its chances of survival, a snake increased its reproductive rate? You see, usually a snake would have to go out and find another snake, mate, find a place to nest, all of that hassle. In fact, some rattlesnakes will even stay with their young for a long time. But this next snake skips all of that by cloning itself, and they're so small that there's even a chance that there's one in your flower pot right now. Braminy blind snakes are a tiny, worm-like snake originally native to parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. But thanks to this unique cloning ability, they've managed to spread to every tropical and subtropical region on Earth. Every single Braminy blind snake is female, and they reproduce through a process known as parthenogenesis. Essentially, this means that every baby Braminy blind snake is a genetic clone of its mother. This means that it only takes a single snake hitching a ride on a plant to form a whole new population in another place. In fact, just in the last 10 years, they've even gotten over here to Louisiana. But they've been in places like Florida for some time now, which is where I tend to see the most. They've become one of the most widespread reptiles on the planet, and they spend their entire life underground feeding on ants, termites, and little tiny insects. Now, funny enough, these are not the only snakes capable of parthenogenesis. In fact, I even believe we have some evidence of pygmy rattlesnakes doing this. If you're one of my colleagues, co-workers, or otherwise friends, do not steal my only good research idea, please. But yeah, these snakes are almost entirely clones. So the next time you go out and buy a plant and you see a strange looking shiny worm in the pot, make sure to give it a closer look and see if you can spot a little flickering tongue, because there's just a small chance that it could be a snake. And no worries at all, they're totally non-venomous, they're not even capable of biting. But now, let's look at some snakes that are a little bit more impressive, some of my favorite weird venomous snakes. Back in 2020, I was introduced to a really cool species, the rough-scaled bush viper. This photo from Daniel Wakefield is one of my favorite snake photos of all time to this day, and it is just a super cool shot. Native to the rainforests of Central Africa, mostly around the greater Lake Victoria region, this snake is famous for its bizarre, almost fuzzy-looking scales. And their colors change drastically depending on where you find them, from these greens and yellows to these more darker shades. They're an arboreal viper species that tend to spend a lot of their life hunting off the ground. And they are particularly common even if you look for them. Also, there's this terrible research note I kept finding about their venom, how we originally thought they were quite mild, but this turned out to be not the case. And I've just kept wondering, who is that case that found out that these are so bad? This snake looks straight out of How to Tame Your Dragon. It actually kind of looks like a zippleback. But overall, their lifestyle, ecology, all of that stuff is pretty typical. They just look really bizarre. But our next snake is one you've probably never heard of, and it's a venomous snake that is like none of the groups we've talked about so far. This is Biberon's stiletto snake. They're part of a group that's sometimes called the stabbing snakes, or burrowing asps. These fossorial snakes are found throughout a wide range in Africa, and they're not a viper or an elapid, but they're more of a secret third thing. In the group Atractospididae, or whatever this big word is. Oddly enough, they're one of the more common snake bites in this region, and they have a pretty large range throughout many arid environments like grasslands and deserts. But I do believe they can be found in some forested areas as well. Now, the main reason that bites are so frequent with this species is because when people try to grab them behind the head, bad idea by the way, not just heading, but handling in general, its fangs actually stick out the side of its mouth. The snake can move its head to the side and boom, you've been envenomated. Now, the reason that they have these side-facing fangs is for catching burrowing prey, usually other reptiles, in really tight burrows around old termite mounds, where there's not enough space to strike in these burrows, so they end up just using those stiletto-like fangs. Fortunately, they're a very mild-mannered animal, and they spend a vast majority of their lives underground, so bites only happen when people try to kill or handle these snakes inappropriately. Still, among the venomous snakes, I find these guys to be quite strange. They kind of look like a giant worm snake with vampire fangs. And I believe there's about 15 species that we currently refer to as stiletto snakes. Biberon's is just the most common. There's also one called the fat burrowing asp. It's literally just a dark, fat version of the same snake, and it is just really funny looking. Also, before I forget, it, if you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, consider subscribing. And if you would want to see more videos like this one in the future, please let me know down in the comments. I'm actually considering making this one a 3-parter because there are a lot of strange snakes across the world. Species like the stiletto snake don't get enough attention in my opinion, and if we're ever going to go and film more animals like this out in the wild, I kind of want to build up more public knowledge around them first. And while we're on the topic of Africa's most notable venomous snakes, we have got to take a look at the spitting cobras. Unlike most venomous snakes, this species has the ability to spray venom from its fangs, and they are deadly accurate, sometimes from several feet away. It's almost unfathomable to me that a snake uses its venom from far away. But across sub-Saharan Africa and into Southeast Asia, this is always something to consider if you're going into snake country. And to me, the most incredible of the bunch is the red spitting cobra. These snakes are most common in North Tanzania and southern Kenya, but I actually have some friends over in Ethiopia that see these snakes very often. In fact, red spitters are not nearly as rare as many people make them out to be, and they're quite plentiful in a lot of scrubby savannas, typically hanging around rock ledges because they tend to live in areas with a lot of large mammals, things like elephants or southern white rhinos, which is why they have that mammalian-specific defense strategy. They hood up so that you can see them, and if you get any closer than that, they'll spit at you so that you don't, trying to potentially blind predators. I remember first seeing them in Steve Irwin's documentary years ago, and I thought to myself that it just had to be the coolest snake ever. The thing that actually makes me nervous about spitting cobras is that they have such a high venom yield. They have so much venom that they can afford to spray it at potential predators, usually having multiple shots worth of venom. And even still, they usually have plenty left over enough for their prey. Personally, I think it's incredible that so many amazing animals can do things like this. And I absolutely love snakes, but spitting cobras, they scare me. Across the world, there's really just 3 snakes that make me really nervous. Red-bellied snakes over in Australia, black mambas in West Africa, and then just any spitting cobra. But now, leaving the arid deserts behind, let's take a look at some of the strangest jungle snakes. Tropical rainforests have a high diversity of species, and you're bound to have some oddballs. And in this type of habitat, there's a lot of opportunity for snakes to do weird things, like jump off of treetops and glide. The paradise tree snake is a gliding snake species that lives high in the jungle canopy, hunting for lizards, frogs, birds, apparently even bats. And to get around, they launch themselves from trees and glide. I don't know, to me it just kind of looks like they're falling with style, but either way, it's still pretty impressive. While they don't truly fly, they're able to get a good distance for an animal with no wings and no webbing. So I think that's just really cool. From South India all the way into the Indonesian archipelago and the Philippines, there are currently 5 different species of gliding snakes. But the golden and paradise tree snakes are the ones that you're more likely to see. And unfortunately, it's because they are heavily trafficked into the pet trade, which is a real shame because from what I've seen, these snakes don't do well in captivity. I mean, just thinking about it, a snake that can actually glide, keeping that in a small enclosure, just doesn't work. Another strange jungle snake that spends most of its life off the ground is the Madagascar leaf-nosed snake, which, as you probably picked up from the name, is an endemic species to Madagascar. Little is known about these snakes in the wild, but as you can see, they have this crazy looking snout. They're another rear-fanged, mildly venomous species, and once again, this helps them to catch things like small frogs and small lizards. Similar to vine snakes, they're perfectly built to camouflage for both dry and rainforest throughout the island, which is one of the reasons we don't know a lot about these snakes. They're actually incredibly difficult to find in high numbers. And once again, a lot of the information we get on these snakes comes from the ones in the pet trade. You'll notice it's a common trend that the weirder the snake, the more threatened it is by poaching and illegal trade. Wildlife trade is the 4th largest black market in the world. So it stands to reason that any snake with a funky nose is going to be a target. While there is another leaf-nosed snake that we'll get into later, these guys are a good example of how tropical environments are home to some pretty strange snakes. But to me, I would say the weirder ones live underground still. Fossorial snakes are often built to never be seen in the first place. And this next batch of snakes is quite rare. The Calabar python is native to rainforests in West and Central Africa, and they are surprisingly difficult to encounter, even though they're an incredibly widespread species. And despite their common name, these are actually a boa, and they are a monotypic species, meaning they're the only one found in their genus. They grow to be a few feet in length, and they are very similar to the rubber boa that we talked about earlier, except they are even stumpier looking. When cornered or confronted, they'll actually hide their real head under their coils and stick up their tail, hoping that predators will attack that part instead. Despite their non-athletic appearance, they are actually constrictors, and they will wrap around their prey and subdue them, typically small rodents. But they also use something called pinioning, where they use their body to smush their prey up against the edge of a burrow. Other snakes in the US actually do this, particularly gopher snakes and pine snakes, but this is a little known fact about fossorial constrictors. They're totally non-venomous, and they have a similar reputation to the rubber boa in the fact that they are totally docile. And just when you think the fossorial snakes couldn't get any weirder, meet the slender quill-snouted snake. Found sparsely throughout parts of eastern and central Africa, these little snakes are usually only a foot to a foot and a half in length. And as you can see, they have this really weird pointed snout. Usually, small fossorial snakes with pointed snouts and an upper jaw projection like this one are typically built to either pop large eggs and eat them from the inside, or to firmly grasp and swallow small lizard eggs. Now, I may be a snake expert, but I am no means an African snake guru. So please, take this with a grain of salt. There are currently no resources that say that these snakes eat eggs whatsoever. But to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense that they don't. Maybe someone in the comments from Africa that's worked with these snakes can enlighten me, because I am really curious. They're tiny, completely harmless snakes. And because they spend a lot of their lives underground, they're rarely encountered by people. They're another rare fossorial snake, even though they have an incredibly wide range. There are currently 3 known species of quill-snouted snakes, but it wouldn't surprise me if we end up finding more in the coming years. And speaking of small fossorial snakes with weird diets, we have the short-tailed snake. In my opinion, this is probably the weirdest snake here in the US. Found only in the pine savannas and scrubby grasslands of north central Florida, this species is actually a king snake, and they rarely exceed a foot and a half in length. They spend so much time underground that even experienced Florida snake hunters rarely see them. What makes these snakes so bizarre is their diet. While most other king snakes are generalists, eating small rodents, lizards, and other snake species, short-tailed snakes primarily feed on a couple of tiny fossorial snakes, particularly the aforementioned centipede snakes, and occasionally even eastern coral snakes. They have also been known to eat Florida worm lizards. But once again, we don't actually know that much about these animals. And keep in mind, everything that I just mentioned is rare. Centipede snakes, coral snakes, Florida worm lizards. I mean, I don't know how these short-taileds are finding them. I'm certainly not. And because all of these prey species are rare, actually witnessing a predator-prey relationship is incredibly difficult. Another harmless species, and because of their dependence on the Florida scrublands, habitat loss has become a growing concern for the species, and they are a near-threatened species. I think short-taileds are really cool, and there's certainly one in need of some conservation efforts here in the States. Now, one thing I want to touch on before we go any further is morphs and mutations. A lot of the crazy weird snakes people tend to show me are just captive bred snakes, bred to look really weird. Things like reticulated pythons, ball pythons, and western hognose snakes are some of the most common examples. But sometimes color morphs can happen in nature. For example, here's a wild, typical looking mud snake. And here's one from the same area. Definitely something going on here, right? This is a good example of a wild morph. I've been lucky enough to see many wild snake morphs throughout my life. But let's take a look at something a little bit more exotic. Take the white-lipped island pit viper, for example. These snakes live on many islands within the Indonesian archipelago, and many of their relatives on other islands, and even the Asian mainland, have a very similar design, this greenish-yellow tree viper style. Now throw in a little bit of island biogeography, add a little bit of genetic isolation, probably some inbreeding, mutations, and boom, blue vipers. Blue animals are really rare in nature. Not only is it not the best camouflage, but it's also hard for animals to be blue for multiple reasons. These snakes are actually truly green, but their scales are this weird shape that reflects the light back in a way that appears blue to us through a process called Rayleigh scattering, which is also the same thing that gives the sky its blue color. And since they're isolated on islands, they've survived pretty well. If you ever go online and see a bright blue viper, it's usually gonna be this one. And while I don't want to get too much into color morphs in this video, I figured these guys were worth talking about since they do appear in nature and they are pretty strange. And speaking of blue, we've spent a lot of time underground and in the tropical jungles, but now it's time to dive into the big blue. Some snakes abandon dry land altogether and are almost fully aquatic. And some of the most venomous snakes on the planet are truly marine. It's the sea snakes. All sea snakes are pretty strange, and there are certainly quite a lot of them. But today, I want to talk about the turtle-headed sea snake. Found throughout coral reefs in the Indo-Pacific, this odd-looking sea snake has a blunt, rounded head, and unlike a typical sea snake, it specializes in eating almost entirely fish eggs. Little known fact is, while most sea snakes are highly toxic fish eaters, a lot of them actually become nest raiders. And these guys will even target specific fish species' nests, and will vary their fish egg diet depending on which stage of their life they're at. Now you might think to yourself, if these snakes are eating fish eggs, why do they need to be so venomous? That's a great question. They're not. The turtle-headed sea snake, of which there are 3 species, are the only non-venomous elapid sea snakes. I think. Listen, there's not a lot of good data on sea snake venom, okay? It's kind of hard to find. The fact that these snakes are non-venomous elapids that live in the ocean and primarily eat fish eggs, yeah, that's pretty strange to me. But unlike turtle-headed sea snakes, our next snakes don't entirely commit to the marine life, and instead can be found hanging out on the beach. These are sea kraits. Sea kraits can be found throughout coastlines all along the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And unlike sea snakes, they still have some more terrestrial features. They have proper belly scales to crawl up on land, and they can oftentimes be seen resting along shorelines, doing the things that you'd expect terrestrial snakes to do. Sunning themselves, shedding their skins, and most importantly, laying their eggs on land. In fact, they're the only group of marine snakes to lay their eggs on land. The true sea snakes actually give birth to live young, so they never have to come onto land. But make no mistake, these are still a marine species by all intensive purposes. Their paddle-shaped tails make them excellent swimmers, and just like sea snakes, they spend most of their time hunting for small eels and fish, typically around coral reefs and other rocky crevice habitats. Now, sea kraits are incredibly venomous, but their bites are rare, and they certainly aren't an aggressive species by any means. In fact, they oftentimes will swim up to divers purely out of curiosity, and I don't think that's ever caused a snake bite incident. The only bites that happen with these guys is when they're harassed or killed. And for our final marine snake, we have a truly non-venomous species that prefers to live more so in coastal estuaries. This is the marine file snake. Once again, they can be found in the northern Australian Indo-Pacific region, and all throughout parts of Southeast Asia. All the marine snakes are somewhat grouped into this area due to the warmer waters and better habitats. Primarily more of those coral rocky reefs. My personal nickname for these guys has always been the seal snake, and I think you can see why. Their face looks just like a seal. They're incredibly wrinkly, and their scales and skin have the texture of a file, hence where they get their name. That loose skin allows them to wrap around their prey a whole heck of a lot easier, and they tend to eat a lot of different things: fish, crustaceans, even some mollusks. It mostly depends on where they're living. They're completely harmless to people, and unlike sea kraits and sea snakes, file snakes are certainly not elapids. And honestly, it's a good place to wrap up the marine section. Whether it's an ocean front dweller or a mangrove dwelling species, the marine snakes are very strange. And oddly enough, despite its common name, our next snake actually doesn't live in the mangroves, but rather the lowland jungles of Southeast Asia. This is the mangrove snake, and it is the world's largest cat snake species, growing to be about 8 feet in length. They're also one of the more notorious mildly venomous species, mostly due to the fact that these guys can be incredibly grumpy. But their bites typically aren't dangerous, they're normally just mild symptoms, and I don't think there's ever been any severe cases or fatalities from a mangrove snake. They have an iconic look to them. Jet black bodies, those bright yellow bands, they are absolutely gorgeous. And because of those colors and their size, these are another snake that's ended up in the pet trade. The problem is, once again, they do not make very good pets. And a lot of these snakes get poached straight from the wild to meet demand. These snakes are highly arboreal, and they often travel long distances within their territories. Many of these imported animals are incredibly stressed. And because they're so common in the trade, many people just presume that these are captive bred, but a lot of the times it's not the case. And I'd argue that these snakes are probably better left in the rainforest. This is a common trend that you're gonna see. It's something that we see over and over again with these weird snakes. The more unusual, colorful, or bizarre a species is, the more likely it is to become a target for poachers. Wildlife trafficking is the 4th largest black market in the world. Whether it's the aforementioned flying snakes or giant mangrove mangrove snakes, people have a habit of wanting to keep these animals that really need a ton of open space, which is an absolute shame. These are some of the strangest snakes on Earth precisely because they need a special place to live in order to survive. Another good example of this is the tricolored hognose snake. Native to the high elevation grasslands and rocky outcrops of central South America, these snakes look like some kind of strange milk snake hognose hybrid. But unlike North American hognose snakes, the tricolors seem to be even more sensitive to habitat changes, especially with their food sources. And they're a very short-lived species. They only live between 6 and 8 years usually. These two things combined mean that when their grassland ecosystems are converted to farms, or snakes are collected for the pet trade, these snakes take a nasty hit to their population. And that is the biggest downside of being a brightly colored or beautiful snake in the modern world. You are going to get trafficked into the black market. And moving on from that somewhat depressing topic, let's take a look at a couple of really exciting snakes. Take a look at this. This is a death adder. Now, if you had to guess, what kind of snake is it? Kinda looks like a viper with that short body and wide head. And it looks like a snake that would be sitting in ambush for long periods of time, stalking its prey and envenomating it with really large fangs. And almost everything I just said is true, except for one thing. It's not a viper. These guys are elapids, and that's because they live in Australia. You see, Australia actually doesn't have any native viper species. All of their venomous snakes are elapids or venomous colubrids. Death adders are basically like a false viper. They have the same hunting strategies and a very similar build and lifestyle, just without the heat-seeking pits and those larger hinged fangs. You wouldn't consider a death adder to be a weird snake at a first glance, but looking at their ecology, they certainly are. Now, take a look at this guy. What is he? We've got smooth scales, a relatively thin body, a somewhat narrow head. This looks like an elapid, but nope, that is in fact a viper. In fact, this is phase viper. Native to parts of China, Vietnam, and other places in Southeast Asia, this is a bizarre species and another monotypic snake. And while they are a viper, they do not have those heat-seeking pits. So they're in their own little weird subfamily that is sometimes nicknamed the pitless pit vipers, which is, I don't know, maybe somebody somewhere needs to be fired for that one. Now, weirdly enough, these snakes also lay eggs, which, if you know anything about vipers, is certainly not the norm. So you might be asking yourself, what makes these snakes a viper? There's a few different hints that they're vipers, but one that's easier to explain is that they have those hinged fangs. These snakes are notoriously difficult to find in the wild and are usually most active during cooler parts of the year, from what I've heard from people that have gone and found these snakes. This one is certainly a gem and one that I'm actually hoping to see myself one day in the wild. Now, despite all the oddballs we've covered, we still have not even gotten to the strangest ones. Our next category contains some of the more notable endangered species across the planet, and a couple of snakes that don't look like they're from this planet. It makes sense that a lot of weird snakes would be endangered, whether it's due to habitat loss or their strange strategies for survival just not being all that great. These snakes are certainly in decline. This is the iridescent shield-tailed snake, a tiny burrowing species found in the western Ghats of southern India. And they are certainly a gorgeous snake. They've got a similar vibe to the rainbow snake with that iridescent sheen and those really smooth scales. But they are not an aquatic species. They are in fact fossorial. And because they rarely come to the surface, like many of the snakes that we've covered, they are rarely seen. In fact, this is probably one of the rarest snakes that we've covered on this list so far. There's good enough evidence to consider these guys as vulnerable, and many even consider them to be an endangered species that are just somewhat data deficient. Instead of tapering to a point like most smaller fossorial snakes, they end in this sort of flattened shield-like build, which is thought to help them anchor themselves into tunnels and possibly even block predators from reaching them underground. And honestly, that's about all I could find on these guys. They're just a really cool tiny snake that we don't get to see often. That bicolored look does tend to pop up with fossorial snakes, kind of like our worm snakes in the US, but these guys are certainly much stranger. We certainly don't see them often, and every now and then one pops up after a rainstorm to remind us that they exist. Now, this next endangered snake is one that we have talked about on the channel before, and it's the Santa Catalina Island rattlesnake. This is a critically endangered rattlesnake species that only lives on one island in the Gulf of California. and they have experienced a significant decline due to invasive species and habitat alterations, but also due to the fact that their island habitat is incredibly harsh. The thing that makes these guys weird is that they are a rattleless rattlesnake. I talk more about this in detail in the rattlesnake iceberg, but basically, island biogeography is one of the main reasons these guys have a reduced rattle, and this is something that's somewhat unique in the island rattlesnakes. Santa Catalinas are a good example of a strange endangered snake that just kind of deserves to be endangered, as mean as that sounds. I mean, they're adapt to the island that they live on, but the second anything changes or even slightly competes with them, they start to lose out fast. And as you can probably imagine, not having a rattle is a pretty clear indicator that as a rattlesnake, you are doing something weird. As I said before, habitat is often a driving factor, and all of the snakes we still have to cover are living in some very interesting habitats. The next two snakes don't even look like they're from Earth. They're so goofy looking that they look like science fiction creatures. But in all likelihood, it's probably the reverse, and these guys have inspired science fiction. This is the Arabian sand boa, the small desert boa species that's native to the Arabian Peninsula all the way into Iran, and yes, this is actually how they look most of the time, and they are supposed to look like that. And there is actually a good reason for this really silly look. These snakes spend much of their time buried beneath the sand, going deeper during the hotter parts of the day and coming to the surface of the sand at dusk, where only the tip of their nose and their eyes stay exposed. That's why they have those googly eyes just stuck on the top of their head. Those upward facing eyes allow them to watch for unsuspecting lizards, mostly geckos and worm lizards. And despite looking really dumb, they actually are decent little predators from what we've seen. Their thick bodies and shovel-like noses let them literally swim through loose sand, very similar to those worm lizards and even our sand skinks here in the US. And I'd also imagine that their thermal ranges are quite high compared to other fossorial species. You've potentially seen pictures of the snake online before. I mean, they are notoriously silly looking snakes. But credit where credit is due, they are actually supposed to look like Jar Jar Binks. Actually, come to think of it, it kind of looks like my ex. And speaking of snakes that look like they just came from a Star Wars film, we have the tentacled snake. Those are actual functioning organs on their face, making this, I think, the only snake on Earth with a paired sensory organ or tentacle-like structure on their face, which is actually really cool. Native to the slow-moving swamps and agricultural fields of Southeast Asia, the tentacled snake is a fully aquatic ambush predator that spends its time pretending to be a stick in the water. It spends a lot of its life hunting and sitting in ambush. Fish are oftentimes their preferred meal, and they can be found sitting in this weird J pattern, stalking them. They often hunt in really murky water, so sometimes rice paddies or even ditches, so I'd imagine tentacles for detecting prey is really useful for when they can't see them. They've been found in Vietnam, Cambodia, and some parts of Thailand. But if I recall correctly, they have been found in some other countries, just incredibly rarely. So yeah, these are two very funky looking snakes. And they're certainly not the only ones of this caliber of alien looks. Once again, if y'all want to see another part of this video, let me know. But now it's time to get to some of our craziest snakes and determine which is the strangest on Earth. This is Schlegel's beaked blind snake. Found throughout the sub-Sahara, mostly in Namibia and South Africa, they're one of the larger blind snake species. And they live in a lot of those arid grassland and desert environments we keep talking about. A lot of people say they look like giant worms, but to me they almost look like a leech. They have this really bulbous body and that weird pointed snout, hence the name beaked blind snake. Like other blind snakes, they spend most of their lives underground, feeding primarily on ants and termites, burrowing through loose and sandy soils all throughout the continent. We don't know too much about them, but whenever we do find them, it's usually in tunnels under logs or after a heavy rainstorm where they get washed out of their burrows. There are quite a few beaked blind snake species, but I'm certainly giving this guy points for that name, Schlegel's. I don't know, I look at this snake and I think, yep, that's Schlegel's beaked blind snake right there. That's a good name. Next we have the ambelobe leaf-nosed snake. I told y'all we'd be looking at another leaf-nosed snake. These elusive little arboreal snakes, much like their cousins, live in Madagascar, and this is now the rarest snake that we've covered so far. My nickname for them is the seahorse snake, because if you look at that face, they just look like a seahorse. When compared to both southern and Madagascar leaf-nosed snakes, you can see they are just much stranger looking. They have a shorter snout, more projections over their eyes, and a very weird, almost flared nose. It's a stranger version of an already strange group of snakes. And as much as I'd like to talk more about them, that's that's all we have. We don't know a lot about these snakes since they are so rare, and there's certainly very little documentation of these animals online. Alright, I want y'all to consider something for a second. Right-handed snakes. Snakes don't have appendages, so they mostly grab things with their mouth. But suffice to say that this snake is right-sided. It predominantly uses its right side. This is Iwasaki's snail eater. These snakes are asymmetrical and have a very pronounced right jaw, with more teeth on the right side than on the left, particularly feeding on snails whose shells have a clockwise orientation. Because of this, most of the snails where they're from proportionally are counterclockwise facing. Now, whether that's because they're eating all the right-facing snails or they just picked the worst day job imaginable, I don't know. But suffice it to say, what do you mean you only eat clockwise snails? You already eat snails, which is weird, but ooh, this one's facing right. Let me just be right-jawed. From a worldwide standpoint, this is strange. From a snail eater's standpoint, it's still strange. And just, what are we doing? I think we're too far down this iceberg. Bring me back to the normal snakes. I want to see a racer snake again. Just bring me back to my colubrids, please. This animal, it's silly. He's just silly. And finally, probably one of the most iconic looking strange snakes on this list. This is the dragon snake, a small, non-venomous species found throughout parts of Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, Indonesia, and southern Thailand. Named for their unique appearance, unlike a dragon, these guys are actually quite small, usually growing to be about a foot and a half to 2 feet max in length. But with those big rows of enlarged dorsal scales, they certainly have a very dragon-like appearance. And unlike a lot of the snakes that we've talked about today, these guys live a relatively normal life. Dragon snakes are a nocturnal species, spending a lot of their time in cool streams, swamps, and wet forests, where they hunt for frogs, tadpoles, and occasionally small fish. They're basically a very specialized water snake. But what pushed this species into the deepest part of the iceberg for me, aside from their appearance, is their weird defensive strategy. When threatened, dragon snakes will flatten out their bodies and become stiff as a board, almost like they're having a malfunction, like a possum or something. And it's almost like some combination of a stress response and a defensive behavior. It's a weird strategy, but it's likely the reason that it has those larger, more rigid scales. Their bodies are super compressed, so it's likely that this makes them either hard to eat or just really unappealing to potential predators. And despite being a fairly widespread generalist species, they are incredibly delicate, and they certainly don't do well in captivity. Another great example of a strange snake that should not be taken from the wild. On top of having a low reproductive rate, yeah, poaching is just one of their biggest threats by far. And to add insult to injury, these guys have a weird chromosome count. They're actually missing a few chromosomes, which is kind of weird to say about a snake. I'm not sure if this plays into their biology or their natural history, but I'd have to imagine it's connected to some of these odd behaviors or even some of their appearance. I don't know. So yeah, dragon snake. It's just this weird looking little dragon-like snake living in Southeast Asia. If you research strange snakes, you've probably seen one before, but I don't hear people talking about them too much, so that's why they've made it this far down. There's not a lot of public information being talked about with these snakes. So what is the strangest snake in the world? We've got a few really good contenders here, from the clone snakes that we covered earlier to basically every snake on the latter part of this iceberg. As a zoologist, phase viper really stands out to me. I'd imagine to most people this just looks like any other snake though. It's a somewhat subjective topic for sure. But I'm going to go ahead and say for now, to me, the spider-tailed horned viper, something we covered in the third layer of this iceberg, is the strangest snake that we've covered by far. I mean, to me, it is just insane for so many reasons, and was part of the inspiration for making this video happen. And when I imagine a strange snake, I oftentimes think of spider tails. But perhaps the strangest snake on Earth is the one that we know nothing about. Snakes have been the source of myths and legends across all of human history. But there's even a few extinct snakes that we know very little about, like the Strangest snake, also nicknamed the dinosaur hunter. This is because we have a really famous fossil of one actively wrapping around a sauropod egg. Pretty cool, because we don't oftentimes think of prehistoric snakes as being dino eaters. But what about the wampum snake? A snake that was actually published in an illustration in the 18th century, but we never actually found it. It's hard to say if this was a practical joke, the last of its kind, or just a simple misidentification from the naturalist that documented it. That being said, we have covered some incredibly strange snakes today, so which one do you guys think is the strangest? With all of the cool snakes that we've covered today, I hope some of you have gained a little bit more appreciation for the world of snakes. They aren't these evil, ugly monsters that people think they are. They're an incredibly important and diverse diverse part of our ecosystems, and many of them are worthy of conservation effort, just like any other animal that we love. That's not to say that we should put ourselves into dangerous situations with venomous species, far from it, but rather give them the space and respect that they deserve. And if we can give them their spaces, most of them will certainly leave us to ours. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. Thank you for supporting this channel as it continues to grow, and most importantly, thank you for helping us on our mission to conserve wildlife. I'm a conservationist first and foremost. It's basically my day job, and I believe that education and appreciation for these animals is the first step of many to saving them from extinction, and most importantly, saving their habitats, making the world a better place to live in. Thank y'all for watching this video, and we will see you guys next time.